thank you everyone for joining wherever you are in the world. I say this every single time I open a webinar, but it is always an honor to spend time with you. And, it would be great if I could see every single face. I'm imagining you in your work environments, wherever you might be, taking the opportunity to kick back, hopefully for about an hour of time to just focus on some learning and application. Resistance management is a hot topic, and for many of the reasons that Rob has shared, but it's one of the top survey or search queries that we get for people joining us on our website. This is the second of a three-part webinar series. In the first part, we talked about measuring impact, and in part 3, we'll talk about activating sponsors. All three of these topics represent some of the highest quantity of search terms that people deploy when they come to the ProSci website. So this series is all about hitting some of those hot topics. And today we're going to focus on managing resistance. Resistance is an interesting word, and as Rob said, I've been in the change management discipline for many, many years, and there's a lot of consternation and concern by some people about the word resistance. It seems so negative, and it has such a negative connotation on some cases, but I want to put forward for you a really simple definition of resistance. To me, this just amplifies the importance of using that word. It's just the act or instance of opposing. And it's opposing for lots of reasons. So we want to get underneath of that today and learn more about what is resistance, how do we proactively manage or mitigate resistance, and what are some of the actions and steps you can take today, tomorrow, next week on a particular project that maybe you are leading, maybe it's one that you are impacted by, maybe it's one that you're highly resistant to. So put on both your change practitioner hat and your impacted person hat and start considering this topic from both of those perspectives. I want to start, first of all, by just unpacking a tiny bit of the nature of resistance and the importance of not underestimating the power of comfort with how things are today. If there are some of you in the attendee group who have neuroscience or psychology background or behavioral sciences, or even some of the social sciences, if you have any kind of background, you know when you unpack the brain science behind change, there are basically both physiological and psychological impacts associated with the natural anxiety and fear that change introduces. The key takeaway message that ProSci talks about is just acknowledging, recognizing, and quite honestly, welcoming that natural reaction to change. So from a practitioner perspective or a change leader perspective, the goal is to mitigate, not eliminate all resistance. Resistance is a very important signal to us. It's a signal that when we start looking at ways to dissect it, analyze it, look for patterns, look for trends, it tells us very important actionable information to take to increase the probability of change success. Now, as a change practitioner, I was a welcomer of resistance. I often tell the story. It sounds funny, right? And even now today, I was working on a project with a client that had a large corporate office in Houston, Texas, and we had just launched an enterprise-wide change that was a technology change that impacted every single person in the organization, 15,000 people. It was a go live that occurred on one morning of one day as we were planning for this change for almost 18 months. The day of the change, I decided to listen. And what I did was I rode the elevator for about an hour, just listening to conversations because it was such a high-profile change, just to hear what people were saying. But it told us a lot about how people were connecting to the change and taking those actions. Kind of laugh at myself for that, but at the time it was a useful tactic. The other thing is we just really need to think about not being surprised by resistance to change, but both expect it and plan for it. again, I always welcomed it. I held change resistance workshops and tried to draw out very early in the process so that it could be managed properly, so that it was a learning opportunity to be constructive to our adaptive efforts around change and to improve those change outcomes. So I'm going to challenge you right away in the webinar to go to that polev.com/change pro. And Rob, if you would drop that live link into the chat so everyone can get access to it. And I want you to think about for just a moment, what does resistance to change look like? You probably have some things that you're experiencing in your own organizations, but when we think about resistance, let's give it some clarity. And let's not just call it resistance to change, but what does it look like? What are people saying? What are people doing or not doing? How are they engaging or not engaging? What are those behavioral indicators of resistance? So look at all of the items that are coming in on the screen. I love having polls during the webinar, not just for the benefit of ProSci, of getting this information, because we certainly do take these poll results and look for those actionable insights to turn them back around to you. But I want you also to hear from others in this environment of the webinar where you're receiving content in a listening mode. What is everybody else thinking? So look at these, right? Ignore, that's not how we do it. Refusal, oh my gosh, refusal is a very active word. Others have given more passive words: anger, reluctance, confusion, lack of understanding. Holding information back, right? Those protective mechanisms. At the end of the day, in many cases, these are our fight or flight responses to things that feel like threats. Now, maybe that's not a physical threat, but it might be threat to my authority, or a threat to my experience, or a threat to my understanding of the way they come, or my social structures. All of these things that sit underneath of the concept of resistance. Look at all these responses coming in. Thanks for polling that way. I want to give you a little bit of context for how we're going to share out information in several different ways, one of which is to go grab that body of research that sits behind everything that we do at ProSci. At its core, we are a research organization. We've been studying and have compiled the largest body of knowledge on change management for 22 years. And I want you to look down there at the topics studied. Resistance management is one of those that we have studied. So we have longitudinal data from over 20 years of what is resistance, how do we manage it, what are the best practices. We even spun up a couple of years ago a topical study on managing resistance to change. Both of these publications are available in the ProSci store. But at the end of the day, the importance is to make sure that we call it out and that we examine it and we learn how to take action to get that constructive output of of resistance instead of the potential destructive impact of resistance. So we did this poll several years ago in that managing resistance to change, and I'm going to give you another opportunity to jump in with your polev.com/change pro. And this poll is a little bit different. It's a drop a pin poll. So look at those 8 different sections and say, based on what you've seen, how would you describe the resistance? I had you describe to me what it looks like, but if we put it into categories, how might you use these frames? So again, we looked at patterns from over 500 responses to this question of what does resistance look like? And we started grouping them. We looked for the patterns and we started coming up these words: disengaged, negativity, avoidance, emotional, work impact, controlling, building barriers, and acting out. We have a phrase at ProSci, we call it name it to tame it. So if we can name the types of resistance that we are encountering, it's easier to tame that resistance, right? When we have low morale. Let's get underneath of that because people are disengaged. There might be many other things going on in the organization. So thank you to everyone who's found the poll. Isn't that fun to just poke your finger at that screen on your tablet, your PC, click your mouse on your screen, and see the pins drop all across the screen. Look at that. For my pattern spotters out here, the information that you're seeing, right? People who immediately start looking for patterns in data. What are you observing? I want to share back with you the actual outputs from this poll that's summarized in that study because we went in and did the data and analysis. And honestly, the order or sequence that I have these displayed in the screen is aligned with the counts, the quantity, right? So 81% of the participants give some formulation or engagement around disengaged. So disengaged, negativity, avoidance, and emotional are the top 4 types. So that's probably pretty consistent, the pin drops that we've seen. So this is interesting, but how actionable is it? So I want to give you some more guidance for how to unpack managing resistance in a contextual model before we start talking about taking action. One of the things that we're going to discuss is root cause. What is the root cause for resistance? Now, I'm going to put it in the context of the ProSci-ADKAR model, which is an amazingly important and valuable tool for identifying root causes. But before we get there, I want you to consider some 2 different contexts for resistance, one of which is that personal context. I might have a difficult situation at home or in my personal family situations that unfortunately comes to work with me, and it just gives me maybe my bar for receiving change goes up in terms of where I can consume differences or distinctions of change because I've got other personal or family pressures or situations. Maybe it's my career history or the plans that I have inside of the organization. Maybe I see this change as an inhibitor to where I saw myself progressing or the opportunities I saw for myself. There's also things that are about how the degree of change will affect me personally. Maybe there's a really big change going on in the organization, and I look around and go, oh my gosh, I am so heavily impacted, and that starts giving more of those barriers to resistance. So in addition to personal, there are organizational context considerations. Let me ask you this question, and it's kind of a reflective question. How good is your organization with change, right? If you polled individuals in your organization and said, how good are we at introducing change? If you find out that you've got kind of a mixed bag or even a negative response, then that history will come along. So if we have been not so good at introducing change in the past, this new change that you're asking me to embark upon with you as an organization, I'm going to look at it and go, you know what, we're not very good at this. So I don't know why this one will be successful when others have failed. So being open and honest about your history, also your organization's values and culture. Do you embody and embrace growth mindset? Do you embody and embrace innovation? Change comes with innovation and growth. What about saturation and capacity? This is a really interesting one right now in the world in which we work. There are change, saturation, and capacity issues associated with all of the changes going on, but just generally, the macro world in which we live and work has an impact on our change, saturation, and capacity. So in all of these cases, these are things that we need to take into consideration as well when we look at root cause. So I want you to point your attention when we talk about that, not just to those organizational things, perhaps personal things. And it's those personal context things that may require you as a people leader or a people manager to come alongside the resistance management role more intentionally to support the people in your team who are impacted by a change or changes. So something to consider. We'll pull that block forward in just a little bit. I also want to bring forward this image. This is something that we at ProSci call change management on a page. It is that distinction or delineation between the technical side of the change, not technological. Certainly technology can be part of the technical side of the change, but this is the design, develop, and deliver of what is changing. Is it a new process or system or tool or roles or location or compensation or job function or any of the other things that we might change when we introduce a project or change initiative? Then there's also the people side, all of the engage, adopt, and use stories as we're trying to improve adoption. Some of you said that change resistant looks like lack of or minimal adoption. So I want to point you to a couple of other considerations using this on a page. We call it the unified value proposition, the integration of the technical side of change, often represented by the project management discipline, and the people side of change, executed by the change management discipline. But there are conversations that you might hear aligned with the technical side and the people side. Here's a potential conversation. The change as it's designed will not deliver the outcomes or objectives. I'm guessing that's not the exact words that you might hear. The exact words you might hear might be, this will never work. We've tried this before, this will never work. Or that tool that they selected isn't the right one. Or that new process redesign is not going to deliver the benefits that we need to achieve to address the reason for change. So there's lots of things that could happen on the technical side because we can have a miss there that has nothing to do with adoption. But if we miss on the technical side, you can bet that resistance will increase. So I invite you to go back and look and make sure that you're solving for the right problems, that you have clarity around the reasons for the change, and you're designing, developing, and delivering the right solution or solutions. Here's some examples of people side, and I want you to think about it in terms of the states of change. What might be the conversation if I've been really successful in the current state? How excited and embracing am I of a change that will challenge my current success? I've spent a lot of time here. I know how things are done, and in transition, I think things might get a little worse before they get better, that bumpy stage of transition. I don't have time to learn something now. We might shift direction, so why should I commit to this future state if I don't think it's where we're eventually going to land? I don't know how things will look in the future. I'm not sure if I will be successful. The unknown is super scary. My invitation to you here is to be insightful and a listener. Listen for those conversations. Listen for those observations. Now, apparently, that's hard, right? It's hard, especially when we're in a virtual environment, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, but it means that we are actively listening for those conversations and what people are saying. Now, all of this is important for several reasons. If I go back to research, one of the questions that we have asked in research is to identify the potential risks to your project or change initiative related to resistance, so it hasn't been managed or mitigated and it's destructive in its impact. So look at all of these here. Are there one or two or maybe all of these that you are concerned about? So if you're looking at the why, what is the compelling why for taking the time, applying the energy and the resources to manage or mitigate resistance? These are your reasons. So invite you, if you're trying to pull a resource plan around resistance management, to come back and pull into what is the reason for the change? What reason or reasons are we changing? And what are the potential risks if we don't take the time to unpack and address and mitigate resistance? Now, I just mentioned that there's some interesting challenges in all of this now that we are in a fully virtual or perhaps hybrid work environment. So what are some of the additional challenges that you are currently experiencing as a result of our contextual work? Go back to pollev.com/change-pro. What are some additional things that you're seeing? I mentioned earlier listening. What opportunity do you have to hear those sidebar conversations, those water cooler conversations, those yes, I was riding the elevator conversations, right? So maybe that's not what you're actually doing, but the listening, right? The observing and listening. Some of the ones that are listed here, people not engaged. When cameras are off in our little squares on a screen, we can't pick up on those indicators, those, the visual cues, the personal cues, the indication that comes up. How many opportunities do we have to engage? Difficult to build relationships. Look at those that are coming in. Language issue, if you have both just in the common terminology, but perhaps that's even in translation and physically the translation of content from one language to another. So we like to use this phrase or term at ProSci that is adaptive response. So we talk about what's so, we talk about so what, and then we talk about and now what? What are we going to do about it? So for many of us, these are the so what. This is what's so, right? These are the things that exist. And so again, riding the elevator, yeah, thank you very much. So when we think about what's so, it's just the case and condition. So maybe we have to be a little bit more creative about this. Maybe we have intentional change resistance workshops associated with the work that we're doing in the impacted groups. So I want you to bring all of this into context, everything that we've talked about so far, the nature of resistance, the contextual, personal, and organizational, the additional challenges that we have today. And let's take this on. So in the rest of this webinar, we're going to spend most of our time talking about resistance prevention. It is so much easier to plan for, address, or eliminate resistance by effectively applying change management before it occurs, so that we don't suffer those negative consequences of having to go back later after a go live, for example, and look around and see that we have to go into resistance response mode, having those effective responses when resistance becomes enduring or persistent. One of the data points from our 11th edition research was that 83% of the respondents, and this was over 1,863 respondents, 83% said that yes, they did make plans to address resistance management and it mattered. Well, I don't know about you, but I think that's an exciting statistic, right? To note that most people are doing what they believe to be the best possible steps and actions to do resistance prevention. And the outcome or output from that was that it mattered. The preponderance of people who said that they met, exceeded, or greatly exceeded expectations from a change was much higher for those individuals who took it on as an intentional approach. So the good news is, it seems to be that we are thinking about this. What I want to do, however, is activate you with some more intentional thinking and mechanisms. So I'm going to introduce a case study, and you're going to have a chance to apply what you are learning and observing so that you can have a more intentional way to bring this back. It connects in your brain. And we're going to focus on that application of the structured process and tools for leading the people side of change. And what do we call that? What is the discipline? What do we call that discipline? That's where we position change management. We apply change management, hopefully, and again, the data supports this, the need to apply change management at the onset of a project or change initiative, and to do it effectively. So we're going to define all of this. We're going to talk about engaging individuals in all of this, but the intent is to avoid resistance, to make sure that we are sitting in front of that. And part of that is done through how we unpack this methodology or framework for managing the people side of change. What you see here on the screen is a graphic that depicts the ProSci methodology. If you are not familiar, or if you want to get more information or a refresh, there was a webinar that we conducted in July specifically on the ProSci methodology. So go listen to that webinar. It's in our recorded webinars and our resources on prosci.com. Go to resources, recorded webinars and look for the one on the ProSci methodology. You can also go to our website. We have a new section on the website about the methodology. Again, those are all free resources available to you to help take you through your learning journey. Sitting in the middle of all of this is ADKAR. ADKAR is that individual change model. I'm sure many of you are ADKAR trained or ADKAR spoken, right? We add ADKAR to our common vocabulary: awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. Just as change is individual, think about this one, resistance is also individual. There may be group patterns of resistance, so we can look at the group profile to determine, but for the most part, we got to get down and figure out how an individual is responding to the change. So how do we do that if we have an organization of 15,000 people or more than that, or even 500 people or 200 people? So we have to have supporting mechanisms to do that. And that's where the ProSci 3-phase process comes in. Is we, during phase 1, start looking at the who has to do their jobs differently and how, as we define impact. And when we look at approach, we talk about what will it do to achieve success. We call out resources, we call out risk, we also call out resistance. There are 5 R's that we look at in define approach. If you want to know what the 5 R's, go research that on the ProSci website or take a look at that ProSci webinar. In phase 2, we plan for resistance. How do we prepare, equip, and support people? Part of that is proactive resistance management. And as our projects are unpacking and we're getting results, we continue to track our performance and adapt our actions. So that's all really critical to success. So all of this is in response to anticipating and responding proactively. So I want to unpack this by person or group, by level in the organization, and then I want to introduce some concepts around organizational attributes. So Rob mentioned in the introduction that over there in your GoToWebinar panel, over in the handouts section, there are 3 handouts. One of them is the copy of the slides that you are seeing on screen right now. One of them is something called a worksheet, and one of them is a checklist. So I invite you to go find the worksheet, go grab it, open it up. It's a PDF, download it. If you are unable to do that, go ahead and grab that plain piece of paper. Rob's right. A plain piece of paper is always a handy thing to have as you're starting to jot down that movement of learning from the conceptual understanding to application, from knowledge to ability. So awareness, desire, knowledge, and ability is part of your journey here as well. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to learn a little bit about this company called Finesta. Finesta Financial is a financial services organization. They were founded in the year 2000, so they are a 21-year-old organization. They have offices in Chicago, USA. That is their headquarters location. But they also have offices in London, Hong Kong, and Sydney. Now, Finesta Financial is, of course, a fictional company, but I have to tell you, it is very much a composite of all of the organizations that we work with on a day-to-day basis, both in ProSci direct markets as well as our global affiliate network of partners who represent ProSci around the world. So what about the change? Here's what's going on. Finesta is going through some office consolidations. You know, everything that has happened in the last 18 months has caused them to go in and look at opportunities to consolidate from 3 different physical office locations in Chicago to a single location. They're calling the project the Global Real Estate Optimization Project, or GREO. For our Chicago office, the office move involves the transition to a permanent hybrid work environment. Does that sound relevant? Is that something that you might be going through today, right? That we are going to have a hybrid work environment. So we're making declarations of what work activities need to take place in office and which can remain remote. For those of you who know Tim Creasy, Tim is brilliant at bringing forward language and terminology, and he's calling it vocation location. What location does somebody need to be in for a particular vocation? If you are instructing students in higher ed, do your participants need to be with you in location if you're doing art history? What about the distinction between art history and a biology class with labs? So you can see that vocation location becomes critical. So you're leading a team of 10 client service representatives, associates. You are on a single pod, and there are 4 pods. So there are 4 other people leaders just like you who each have between 8 and 10 client service associates. Some of your team will remain remote. Some of them will return to in-office work between 50 to 100% of the time. So the vocation location is actually mixed in your team. So that's the change. So what resistance challenges do you anticipate related to the GRIO project for your team? So you are the team leader, so put yourself in the shoes of the other pod leaders such as yourselves. What are some of the resistance challenges that you are anticipating, just given this brief introduction to the change at Finesta associated with GRIO? Maybe this is a really real profile for you. You might be going through this exactly today. And that's one of the reasons I articulated the change challenge in this way, because I think it's probably pretty real. Oh gosh, look at these resistance challenges, resentment, rumors, confusion. I saw one that passed by that said inequity, right? That it feels different for different people. The choices feel unfair. There's fear. Think about this too. For anyone who's ever lived or worked in Chicago, I lived and worked in Chicago for 6 years, and for a while I lived downtown and commuted out to the suburbs, and then for a while then I commuted right to the downtown. So I took a train versus I took a car for an hour to 2 hours a day each way to get out to the suburbs. What if that office relocation is somebody who's living in the suburbs and now has to commute to downtown or vice versa? So there's even potential impacts to my personal or family situation. What if I need to pick up my kids and I just can't get there? So all of these are certainly resistance challenges. So look at all these things, right? So I hope you're not feeling overwhelmed, right? Because we're going to unpack this and we're going to unpack it together. So as we imagine the resistance challenges for the individuals, how might that look? What I want to do is I want to introduce and talk about ADKAR from the perspective of identifying types of resistance or the way that I'm responding to these changes. It could be anticipated or observed resistance. So many of you are familiar with the ADKAR model: awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. We can map or survey for ADKAR. I fully understand the reasons for this change. I have chosen to participate. I have knowledge. I know how. Ability is I am able or proficient, and reinforcement is I will continue to. So I invite you to consider, as the pod leader for your 10 people, that you can run an ADKAR assessment on each of those 10 people. Hopefully, if you're the change practitioner or the leader for this overall initiative, you've been tracking group ADKAR scores all along, because there are things that you can be doing as the way that you engage your sponsors and senior leaders around awareness, for example, to start articulating the why now, what if we don't messages for awareness. So awareness can sit at the group level, it can sit at the org level, it can sit at the impacted individual level. So I want you to think about one of those people on that team. I'm going to ask you to use your imagination, and maybe you don't have to go too far with your imagination, because this is actually something you're involved with today. Maybe you are impacted by these decisions, or maybe you're leading them. So how might we use ADKAR to help manage resistance? I want you to think about that. So over in your handouts section, you have a download. The PDF has 2 sections. The top part of that PDF says Resistance Management Plan by Person or Impacted Group, which could be a function, a role, a location. There's lots of different ways that we can think about our impacted group. And I want you to pick an awareness, an ADKAR barrier point. Maybe it's awareness. Maybe that's where you want to start. But add in your worksheet or on your blank piece of paper a scenario, maybe it's mine, of this new hybrid work environment. Maybe it's a change that you're going through. Name the person or group, circle the ADKAR barrier point, talk about what the resistance or anticipated behavior, what you're hearing, what attitudes you're seeing, talk about root causes, talk about approaches or tactics, the how, consider the who, the when, and then what might success look like. So I'm going to give you a minute to do this on your own, and I'm going to pull the ADKAR model on a page visual back up because I think it'll be a great aid to you here, including over on those triggers for building are some of the things you might do. So I'm going to give you a minute to just work on this. Think about this for GRIO if you want to make it up or use one for your own project. When you're thinking about your root causes, I invite you to go back and consider some of those personal or organizational contextual elements associated with the root cause. What are the psychological or physiological impacts of what the change means to this group or to a particular person? So you probably don't have time to go through that full row, but I invite you to use this as a practical application aid. Again, today, tomorrow, next week, as you're imagining, for many of you said your hot topic is because this is happening today. So the first frame that I want to give to you is to consider the ADKAR barrier point as the place to point your resistance radar and to think about what you're hearing and what actions you might take. Now, the who column is interesting. That was one of the things I want you to focus on is who. There are places in the organization that when we look at our research, what we know the role, the number one indicator of success for projects or change initiatives is active and visible sponsorship. So maybe the awareness barrier isn't related to you as a people leader, but to the leaders of the organization who are giving those compelling why now, what if we don't messages. So the who is a critical element. I want you to think about who should be or what is the role that you need to activate to endorse the change or to help through the resistance management. So what you're building is ADKAR-based role plan, and I want you to put your people leader hat back on. Many of you may have heard this acronym at ProSci before. It's the CLARK acronym, and it's aligned with those 5 key roles over on the left-hand side. This was when I went through one of the ProSci training programs as I was a change practitioner, one of those aha moments. For those of you who have gone through this program is the Leading Your Team Through Change program. It's a one-day program. It's delivered virtually. The next one is December 10th in the US, but it unpacks the CLARK acronym. So if you're a people leader, highly, highly recommend this one-day program. But as we look at how ADKAR measures up or aligns with those barrier points, we can throw all kinds of things into our resistance management plan, but they need to be intentional. So I need to, as an advocate and a communicator, pass on the why now, and what if we don't, my impact to my team. I need to demonstrate commitment for this change. I was working in a client engagement. I was delivering a 3-day certification program a couple of years ago. They were going through an office change, and the floor that we were delivering in the webinar, the training program was on a floor that was being remodeled, and sitting over in the corner were 2 people sitting in this overall huge space associated with the remodel. And I asked my host, I said, well, who are those people? And she said, those are the 2 senior leaders of the organization that's going to move into this space. Talk about demonstrating commitment. When they were touring and doing the engagement activities, their 2 senior leaders were sitting there already working in the space. You see, resistance manager, identifying and addressing those root causes, you have to get underneath of that. It's hard work, it's personal in many cases, but that's where movement occurs. You have to support knowledge and ability, and again, back at reinforcement, making sure the results and feedback get back to my project team as the liaison for my team, and also that resistance management role continues past go live and all of the reinforcement, celebration, and sustainment of the change. So isn't that fascinating, that Adkar-Clarke intersection? It starts to unpack this in a much simpler frame. Just because I can do lots of things, let's target our actions on the things that matter when they matter by the person that matters doing them. And you are the primary resistance manager for your team. I want to pull some research back in again and find out on resistance. What are the top reasons for employee resistance? Look at number one, lack of awareness of the reason for the change. I don't know about you, but I can solve for that one. Those personal situations or organizational contexts are a little bit more complicated, in some cases lots more complicated, but I certainly can solve for lack of awareness of the reason for the change. The respondents to the survey said that had they done this more intentionally, that they felt like over almost half of the employee resistance they experienced was actually avoidable by doing this work intentionally throughout the process. What about for managers? I put you into the shoes of a people leader. For 10 people on that client services pod in the Chicago office of Finesta, but what about your resistance? Don't underestimate the resistance that you or we or me, each one of us goes through during times of change, no matter what our role is in the organization. We are employees first, and managers or senior leaders second. Organizational culture is the top reason for manager resistance, right? How I can engage organizationally. But look, number two is, again, lack of awareness and knowledge. Survey respondents said that 51% of them felt that, again, half of the resistance encountered by managers could have been avoided. So let's think about our manager role for just a moment. As a client services people manager, what resistance do you have to the GRIO change? Think about it for yourself, right? There's 10 people impacted on your team, but what is this going to do to you? What does it mean for you? Yeah, what if you don't want to move? That one came up. Maybe you are isolated. Maybe your vocation location as the people leader has been designated as being back in on site or in office, maybe close to full time to support your team. So look what happens if you're not able to come alongside this change. You know, every single day we function and operate as employees, right? We exist in our organizations. We're paid for our services and contribution to our work. So at a certain point, you have to say, this is just what's so, right? This is what's good for the organization. And that's why holding that bigger frame of why now, and what if we don't. But I want you to honor the process that you go through first before you can lead others through change. We often think of this as put on your own oxygen mask before you help the person next to you. You need to think about what, in fact, this means to you. So you don't want to go from Skokie in Chicago's western suburbs. I wouldn't either. I had to go from downtown Lincoln Park to the suburbs, right, all the way out to Schaumburg, and it was not a fun commute. So think about that for a moment, and I want to introduce another conceptual frame for you. So the manager's challenge is you need to effectively lead your team through change, leveraging those Clarke roles, while you are most likely engaged in the particular change yourself. So you've got to get yourself through your desire barrier point before you're going to be able to advocate authentically for this change with others. What does that mean? It means you also have to have commitment. And why now, what if we don't? You have to have chosen to participate. So how many of those resistance challenges that you're experiencing are due to the fact that either yourself as a people leader or manager, or other people leaders or managers or mid-level managers have themselves not gone through their own awareness desire to be able to advocate for the change? It's something that we have to think about intentionally. So as a project lead, I need to make sure that all of my people leaders have this ACAR journey progression before their team members do. Give it the time and the attention that it takes, or else we're going to sub-optimize our risk mitigation. And when people come to me and say, I'm really concerned, I don't like, this isn't what I wanted, I'm scared or nervous, you don't want to look back at them and go, me too, right? You have to go through that process yourselves, and that's part of our people leader role in our organizations. So I invite you to think about that manager's challenge and how you might embrace or and deploy that. And I want you to go back to your worksheet. And I want you to think about resistance management plans, not by an impacted group or person, but by levels in your organization. Are you seeing or observing a broad band of employee resistance, or a broad band of mid-level manager or higher resistance, or executives and senior managers? The research tells us, think about this for a moment, what do you think is the most resistant group in an organization? If you had to look at it by level, think about an answer for yourself in your organization. What do you believe is the most resistant group? Our data tells us it's our mid-level managers, because there are things happening below them that push up, and there are things happening above me that push down. I feel compacted in the middle. Maybe that loss of power of control or overloading of responsibilities. So I want you to take another minute, and it's very much the same questions, but now it's got a role-based focus. So think about the what, the how, the who, the when, and what success looks like from a role-based focus, pulling in those root causes of resistance from the ProSci research that you see in the second column, or from those personal or organizational. And take a minute and just think about that. What does that look like by level? Maybe you take on mid-level managers or those most resistant group. In this one, I really want you to focus on that who column, the person or role to activate. Who is the role or person I would activate for employees? Who would I activate for those mid-level managers and supervisors? Who would I activate for those executives and senior managers? The who is just as important in many cases as the what, because of organizational influence, because of the authority that is afforded to particular roles. But it also assumes that we've got trust in our organizations and we've got a history of successful change. So maybe you are now for the first time building the new history of successful change focused on resistance and resistance management early in your projects or change initiatives. So what we've articulated right now is a couple of different frames for how you might build out a resistance management plan. So then the question is, does every change or project initiative need a resistance management plan? It is my belief as a change practitioner that you must always bring up resistance, because no matter how simple or how unimpacting or how welcome a change is, don't underestimate that control with the comfort with the current state, and again, the physiological and psychological impacts. So what I want to do is introduce for you that there are different ways to scale your resistance management effort. Not all changes are created equal. I have on screen a model that we introduced in the ProSci methodology that's a risk grid. We introduced the concept of change characteristics and organizational attributes as a survey of identifying the people risk for a change from low being change ready, small incremental change, to high being change resistance and a large disruptive change. So I, for one, introduced a project for a client. We were going in and doing a refresh on their intranet. The intranet was awful. It was old. It was didn't work. There were a lot of technical complexities, but from a user perspective, it was a pretty simple and welcome change. But we still did a resistance management workshop, and we came up with mostly almost like a 1 or 2 page resistance management plan. And it had mostly to do with change management for awareness at the ADKAR level and knowledge, just the differences and distinctions. Compare that to a high-risk change where a resistance management plan might be multiple pages or multiple efforts woven throughout your overall project model. So I think there's some things that I would invite you to consider regarding the scaling of your effort. Not all changes are created equal. Not all resistance management plans need to be the same. So again, that's just that insight and awareness you build through doing this work and kind of building that intuition around the need. Or maybe you just focus on your most vocal groups or resistance impacted individuals. Once you can get certain individuals turned, in many cases, those individuals become advocates for the change, right? Just helping them get through that process. Our change agent networks are critical in this as well. How can you engage, or how might you engage change agent leaders or networks to help support your change resistance management efforts? So those are some of the things I wanted to unpack. All of this has been in the concept of proactive, right? Over there on the number 1. What about number 2, right? We did resistance prevention. All of this is all about resistance prevention. Now what I invite you to do is also consider your projects or change initiatives. What might be your resistance response? What we do is encourage you to think about post go live or post implementation or during that sustainment, project sustainment and individual reinforcement phase, how you might address that resistance response. And one of the things we talk about in our practitioner program, our 3 days, is 10 steps or tactics for a resistance response that's very reactive. And in that, we're really coming in and looking at it and saying, what are the tactics that we want to use or can use when it becomes enduring or persistent? To me, this is considered something like a playbook. So you have a playbook of things you might be able to do. How do we react? And understanding always that resistance is natural. So there is, no matter how much we are preventive in our approach, there's always going to be those things that show up. But again, the data said over half of the resistance could have been managed by that proactive instead of reactive resistance. So don't save it for the reaction, because by that time, we've probably started down the path of all of those negative project outcomes, including building an additional history of failed change. So as I said, I was going to focus almost everything on proactive. Reactive is a response to. You now have a handout that I invite you to take back to your work, again, today, tomorrow, or next week, and figure out how you might be able to use this when we get under it, when we look at root cause. The approach, our how or tactic, is now targeted, not just our ADKAR barrier point to the root cause. We talk about who we need to activate. Maybe it's just that senior leader conversation with a mid-level manager that we need to activate. Maybe I need to sit down and have a virtual coffee with one of my teammates and say, you know what, I really need you to step up and be a leader on this for the rest of the team. What are your concerns and considerations? How might we overcome them? And how might I count on you to help lead and demonstrate success? The other thing is there is in the handouts and also on our website under blog.prosci.com a resistance checklist that's part of a resistance blog post that just went live in the last week and a half. And I also invite you to go to prosci.com and just type in the word resistance in our search bar, and you're going to get a plethora of resources and access to information, again, all free resources to help you think about all of the things that we've talked about and discussed today. We know it's a hot topic. We know it's one that sits in front of us every single day. Maybe it's expanded or has morphed into different characteristics with our new virtual and hybrid work environments. But again, the intentionality of what's so what, now what, and making sure that we take on resistance, because if we don't, it'll take us down. So I hope that you were able to get a key takeaway. I would invite you, I'm going to flip over. I've got 4 minutes left. I'm going to bring Rob back on to ask any questions, but if you could jump over to the questions pane and type in what is one key takeaway that you have from today. I want you to really lock in one action, one idea, one application that you're going to apply as a result of spending this time together over the last hour. So thanks for those of you who are jumping. If you can stay for Q&A, we'd love for you to do that. Rob, are there any questions that has come in?
Yeah, there are. Before we get into the questions, I just want to remind the attendees that you had mentioned a couple of links. They are in the chat pane, so click that down arrow in chat and you can find the ProSci methodology webinar as well as the 5 tips for managing resistance to change. So Karen, our first question today is from Yvonne, and she has a great question. This is an important one. What if, after applying the ADKAR model, staff do not adopt the change? What other options are there? Do you meet staff where they are and not go forward with the change? Any suggestions that you can provide? That's Yvonne's question.
Yvonne, that's a brilliant question, first of all. If it were oh so easy, right? We can do all of the things that we've talked about and still run into challenges. My recommendation to you and what I have done, being in this situation, is to go unpack it even deeper, right? And you may need to go back and look at the technical side of the change. It may be that the reaction and response has nothing to do with what we're asking people to do or their ADKAR journeys, but the solution that is being proposed is just dead wrong, right? It doesn't solve the problem, or it sub-optimizes or impacts things in a negative way. So be open to the fact that it's not the people side of change, it might be the technical side of change. The other thing is, at a certain point, we have to deploy those response mechanisms that might include, everything from, the personal appeal example that I just gave, but maybe we've got dissenters that there really are organizational context or impacts, right? So I've seen it happen, unfortunately, right, where you have to get to the point where you have to engage your human resources or your talent teams to help you with some of these organizational issues. But I'm guessing that in most cases, you can come alongside it with the right communications, the right role engagements, getting our senior leaders back involved, having compelling why messages. I've been through changes where organizations are, for example, splitting, and there's a lot of downside associated with the divestiture. Not every change has a positive what's in it for me, but at the end of the day, we're employed by our organizations and we're employed to help bring success in our roles. So sometimes it gets kind of messy, but unpacking it, I think, at the lowest level possible, getting to root cause, and then really being intentional about both proactive and reactive responses. So again, back to your playbook. I think have a really solid playbook.
A great answer, Karen. Thank you. Very thorough. Hopefully, ProSci Nation, you have found that helpful. We want to do our best to make sure that we're respecting everyone's time. So I just want to say thank you, Karen, for the insightful and excellent presentation. Again, thank you, ProSci Nation, for your questions. This brings us to the end of our broadcast. I and the ProSci team want to thank you for joining us for today's presentation of Change Management Hot Topic, Managing Resistance. Have a great day wherever you are, and remember, change happens one person at a time.